Traps and threats in the dungeon! Do you want to be a better dungeon master? Me too. Hi, William Tramp, also known as This Effin' GM here, and today I'm taking a quick break from my sandbox series to address a question I got about adjudicating dungeon travel times, or specifically, positioning. If you have not already seen my video about tracking time in a sandbox, which you can see right here, I talk about how I divide dungeon turns into 10-minute chunks with actions that are relevant to what a dungeon crawl might need to cover. But the question that arose was, how do I track or organize character movement and positioning when an encounter or a trap is triggered? And I thought that was a pretty good question that deserves some words on it. Over 1,600, in fact, so strap in. All right, let's talk about a couple of factors that I consider when deciding where a character is in the dungeon or room or general area, I guess, when all hell breaks loose. First, let's talk about the core assumption I have in any role-playing game. And this is a core assumption I think was much more popular to call out in older games, but as time has gone on, we have somewhat forgotten to teach people. The core assumption is, the player characters are competent.
The player characters are competent.
In a dungeon crawl, I take this to mean that the characters are taking every reasonable precaution when investigating a dangerous area. I don't ask, hey, which one of you announced holding a light source and then penalize them with darkness if they weren't. I ask, who would have been holding it if a situation pops up where that was necessary? I don't force people to say, I'm searching for traps. I assume when in dungeon crawl mode, they are always looking for traps or enemies or danger, and I only ask for the perceptive roll when it's necessary. The characters are trained professionals, even at level 1. I assume their characters know to keep a light source on and to keep an eye out for danger, unless they are otherwise engaged, like with an investigative action. Now, every game master and group will have a different idea of what is reasonable, but in my mind, a weapon, shield, or spell focus in hand, a light source, and being on the lookout for danger is a basic reasonable assumption I think we can all agree on. Next, let's talk about marching order. Marching order is a time-honored tradition in dungeon crawls in which the adventuring party establishes what order they are traveling in through the dungeon. I tend to use 5-foot squares on all of my dungeon maps, and the halls tend to be anywhere from 5 feet to 20 feet wide, with the average being about 10 feet. Now, regardless of the hall's width, I will have my players use miniatures or tokens to represent their marching order so I and they have a visual reminder. Now, I do not expect them to move these miniatures around on a map. That's a lot of constant shuffling and minute decision making that I find really bogs down gameplay. Instead, I have them set the miniatures up in a line, with each character presumptively taking up a 5-foot square of space. If the hall they are traveling through is 5 feet wide, that line has one column, and they know they have to go single file. If it's 10 feet wide, they can have up to 2 columns. If 15 feet, 3 columns, 20 feet or more, 4 columns, 5, 6, whatever. Now, establishing marching order is important for a number of reasons. First off, when it comes to perceiving traps or threats up ahead, I only let the player characters in the front row make the needed perceptive checks to discover them. That's the benefit of being in front. You have the opportunity to find the dangerous pressure plates and the like. Second, when it comes to perceiving threats from behind, such as someone tailing the party or a random encounter originating from behind them, we use the back row's perceptive skills. That's why often we have rogues in the front, rangers in the back. Now, this means the people in the middle are typically not doing much to assist in these cases, but luckily for them, they're often sheltered from attacks via cover and from traps via relative distance, so that's the trade-off. Now, there are certainly caveats to this rule. For example, if a wizard is using a familiar to join the front line, I'll have the familiar join in on the perceptive skills. Fun fact, most familiars are small enough to fit into another character's space, especially in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, so having a cat trot alongside the road gives another pair of eyes on potential threats and rewards the wizard for having thought of such a great idea. Did I say road or rogue? I meant rogue. Anyway, how do I determine when said threat is perceived? Well, I tend to play that by ear. If it's a random encounter, I use rolls to determine the distance the encounters start at, which a table for can be found on a lot of game master screens, if not the book like it should have been. So for example, if I roll a random encounter and then I roll 2d6 times 10 to determine the distance of the encounter begins 50 feet away, then I know that somewhere 50 feet away a threat is lurking. Then I check the map and I see which direction the threat would make the most sense to come from. If it's a horde of skeletons and I know the catacombs are up ahead, then the skeletons are coming from up ahead. If I know the catacombs were, already passed through by the players, well, then the threat comes from behind. If I cannot immediately see a clear answer, I just roll it randomly. And if I get an odd number, the enemy is behind them. How odd that you didn't notice that. Or if it's even, then it comes from up ahead. The moment I make these decisions is the moment the encounter begins in my mind, and we either go into theater of the mind, keeping in mind relative positioning based on marching order, or we go to a map where we then place the PCs in the area in that same marching order. Now for traps, I typically let them perceive it when they are right about to trigger it. A nice little heart skips a beat moment. You notice a near imperceptible shift in the floor right underneath your outstretched foot. You step back, realizing there's something a little off about the flagstones just ahead. Something like that. Ooh, side note, that would be a really nice moment for a random encounter to come from behind when the PCs have their backs up against a proverbial wall. Anyway, on the subject of random encounters, I want to talk about understanding the layout of the area. You do not need to have a fully detailed map set down on the table in front of the players, although that can really help them, but you do need some way to indicate to the players the basic layout of areas that they walk into. I often use cardinal directions or basic directional language, like left, right, ahead, behind, north, east, southwest, to indicate where points of interest in a given area lie. Usually, this is based on a personal map that I am looking at, if not one on the table. I reiterate these directions and positioning constantly to the players on each of their turns as they announce their actions so that they understand their positioning relative to one another when investigating an area. So let's say, for example, the players walk into a room about 20 feet on each side through a door on the south wall, where on the west wall is a dresser, the east wall there's a desk, in the middle of the room there's a carpet, and then another door lies along within the northern wall. I'll ask them what they're up to, and as they commit to the action, I broadcast the location. So Rodney is heading to the east wall to investigate the desk, Mary is heading to the door on the north wall to guard it in case of danger, and Sam is heading to the west side of the room to look over the dresser, and I make sure I keep making that clear to everybody where they are in position to one another. Mary, you're passing Rodney as you head north when he heads east. Now, if a random encounter breaks out, I will determine where it originates from, as I mentioned before, either through checking the map or a die roll. So in the example I just gave, if a horde of skeletons comes into the room somehow, then it's probably going to be through one of the doorways, and then if I check the map and there's no catacombs nearby, then I'll roll randomly, and let's say in this case, they come through the north door. Now, in this example, if they're coming through the north door, I'm going to assume that Sam and Rodney, who took investigative actions to look things over, are on opposite sides of the room, one along the east, one along the west. But Mary is right by that door. And since she was looking out for danger, wasn't taking any other investigative action, I will give her and the skeletons the benefit of surprise, and the other two who were distracted the disadvantage of being surprised. I hope that makes sense. Now, either way, this would not be possible if I did not first make a commitment to the room's layout. And this is why, regardless of whether we are playing Theater of the Mind or using a map on the table, I always have my own personal map key to keep it all straight, for them and for myself. Okay, now, let's talk about traps. If we're using the same example, let's say instead of skeletons coming through the door, the dresser is trapped with a poison dart. Now, I know that Sam is going to the dresser, and only Sam has a chance to perceive that trap. But because the nature of the trap is a small dart with one target, I know that only Sam runs the risk of being hit by it. Now, on the other hand, if the trap instead created a fan of flames 15 feet wide and long, then I know that Sam and Mary, who is effectively midway through the room at the north door, are at risk, but Rodney should reasonably be fine. Understanding the layout of the room is key in these situations. For traps, I also add in an extra step and make sure that I understand the trap's trigger. Pressure plate, tripwire, arcane sensor, each type of trigger is important to understanding how to reasonably adjudicate the trap going off, and to know whether the player's creative investigation styles give them an edge or a bane against the trap's effects. Okay, so that's it. That's how me and my players tend to keep track of positioning and threat adjudication. Remembering that the players are competent, establishing and visualizing a marching order, constant broadcasting of positioning and distance to the group, and making sure that I understand the nature of the threats or the layouts of the areas that they may come across. I hope this answered your question, my friend, and I hope it helps you to run even greater games at your table. On that note, I have to get back to my day job, so I look forward to seeing you all next time.